All right, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so my name is Sam Gebru. I teach in the political science department at Tufts. I'm really excited to have you all here today to welcome to campus a friend of mine, a fellow Cambridge resident of mine, and someone that I am a big fan of, Jessica Lander, to today's event, Making Americans, Reimagining Immigrant Education. I want to thank our co-sponsors, including the Education Department, the Civic Studies program at Tisch College, and the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Study and Human Development for supporting this event, for promoting it, and convening us on this really important topic today. The overarching questions that we're going to try to answer in the next hour with Jess: what does immigrant education in America look like today? And how can educators, policymakers, and school systems better nurture a sense of belonging in newcomers and help students become Americans? I can't think of someone that is better equipped in our community to talk about this than Jess. I have seen her students firsthand, the way they admire her, the way they worship her. Literally, Miss Lander is a big deal in the Lowell Public Schools at Lowell High School, where she's traveling every single day to make a massive impact on the lives of students who oftentimes are on the margins and are forgotten. A little bit about Jess. As you know, she's a teacher, an author, and an advocate. I'm going to read a little bit from your bio. You have won several teaching awards, including being named the top 50 finalist for the Global Teacher Prize in 2021. And in 2023, was a finalist for the Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. And also in 2023 was the Massachusetts History Teacher of the Year. And previously has taught middle school students, high school students, and university students in the United States, in Thailand, and Cambodia. So in addition to her teaching, Jess is also a policy consultant. You will often see her name published in the Boston Globe and other articles as well. Your mother does a very good job in circulating those emails to us. She has authored several books, including this most recent one, Making Americans, Stories of Historic Struggles, New Ideas, and Inspiration in Immigrant Education. In this book, she offers a comprehensive look at immigrant education as told through key historical moments and court decisions, current experiments to improve immigrant education, and profiles of immigrant youth and schools across the country. And today, we're going to have a wonderful presentation where she'll be sharing some of her work and lessons learned from this book. And I understand there's a bit of an activity as well, so we will be talking to each other at some point today. So if you don't know your neighbor, you will learn their name today. But without further, I would like to welcome Jessica Lander.
Thank you, Sam. That's just such a generous and lovely introduction. Sam and I have worked together for many years, and I so admire the work he does, and was just really, really excited when he asked me to come speak. Thank you all for coming out on a cold Wednesday evening in between classes or after classes. I'm excited to share with you some of the stories that I have been grappling with, learning about, and thinking about over the last 4 years. And as Sam said, I am a high school teacher, and so I'm not going to talk at you the whole time. We are going to get interactive. So I hope you're ready. I wanted to start us off with the following here. Today in the United States, 1 in 4 children are immigrants or the children of immigrants, 1 in 4. And there's a role for each of us in ensuring that students feel welcome, ensuring that students feel a sense of belonging so that they can succeed both in schools and out in the community. And I'd like to think about some of the lessons that we can draw from our past, some of the lessons we can draw from what's going on right now, from our young people, to think about what we can do in this room as folks involved either in education or in policy or in other capacities, and think about what we can do collectively. As Sam said, I am a teacher first and foremost. I have the honor and the joy of teaching recent immigrant and refugee students at Lowell High School, about a 25-minute drive north. I was there this morning. My students come from about 30 different countries, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. And it is the work they do the ways in which they are fully embracing and going after their own education, supporting their families, supporting each other, and then taking that learning out into the community that inspired me to go out and do this work. So I just wanted to start here and center my why in my students. If you ever find yourself in Lowell, come by. We're room 102 at Lowell High School, first integrated high school in the country, integrated at conception in 1831, and one of the most diverse in the country. And so it's the work they do in the classroom, the work they do in the community, and also the work they do nationally that has, for me, really inspired my desire to go out and think how we do better by them. My students bring so many strengths into our classrooms, into our communities, but so often the strengths of newcomer students are not recognized. And so 4 years ago, I set out from the classroom to both understand how I could be a better teacher to my students, but also understand how we collectively could do better by our students. When I set out 4 years ago, I recognized pretty early on that I needed to understand 3 sets of stories. First, stories of the past. There are just really extraordinary landmark Supreme Court cases, laws, and movements over the last 150 years that have transformed what our schools look like today. And many of those stories are not often known. They're definitely not often taught. I'll be first to say that I was not taught most of these stories when I was in school, but they need to be taught and they need to be known because they very much shape what our schools look like today. So first are those stories of the past. Second are those stories of the present. There are today across the country really creative, innovative experiments happening in classrooms from North Dakota to school districts in North Carolina. And they're doing really interesting work in supporting newcomers in a whole range of ways, but they're also not really known outside their communities. And we need to know about them because we need to learn about best practice. We need to learn from each other. We also want to be able to grapple with the challenges together. So we have to learn from stories of our present. And then finally, for me, the heart of this work is the personal, our young people. We need to learn from our young people. It is essential that if we're serious about reimagining immigrant education for newcomers, we have to learn from our newcomers themselves, learning from them about their experiences of coming to this country and their experience of our schools. And I think we have a lot to learn from these 3 sets of stories, stories of our past, stories of our present, and stories of the personal. And with that foundation, I think we're best set up to think about what's possible. Now, I traveled across the country. If you want to come in, please come right in. We've got seats. I traveled across the country. I spoke to educators. I spoke to those who they or the family helped transform history. And I sat down with some of my former students. And from what they taught me, it all came back to one thing. That's the importance of belonging. And that's something we're talking more and more about in schools. Belonging is essential. Belonging is essential for all people, but it's particularly important for young people who are creating new homes and new lives here. But how do we as institutions, either as universities or as schools or as educators or policymakers or advocates, help nurture that sense of belonging? What does that actually look like in practice? And from all these folks I talked to, I pulled out, I'm calling 8 pillars. I present them to you. I hope they resonate. As these 8 pillars that from all the folks I talked to, I think really help to nurture that sense of belonging. First, that importance of new beginnings and those supportive communities. The assurances of security and those chances to dream. The importance of committed advocates and that recognition of students' strengths and assets. The need to accept all of our students for all their many beautiful identities. And finally, the importance of recognizing, valuing, and investing in student voice. So I have, over the last 4 years, been exploring these 8 pillars and thinking about the lessons we draw from looking at stories of the past, present, and the personal to better understand these pillars, and then to think about how we go apply that to what's possible. Now, here's our roadmap for today. I would like to share with you some stories. Because part of this is storytelling. And I also want to make this interactive too. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to give you 3 stories of the past, 4 stories of the present, depending on timing, and then a story or 2 of the personal, and then we'll think about what's possible. So let's start with the past. I'm going to give you just 3 stories, and I out myself as a history teacher. Sam already did. So I nerd out about this. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to try to rein myself in, but they're really powerful stories. So very, very briefly, our first story is that of Robert Meyer, who is a parochial teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Nebraska. And on a May afternoon in 1920, he is teaching his students the Bible in German during recess. And for doing this, he is arrested. Because at the time in 1920, it was illegal to teach languages other than English in Nebraska. Indeed, in half the states in the country, it was illegal to teach languages other than English. In some states, it was legal to speak languages other than English in public spaces, including on the train and on the telephone. But Robert Meyer doesn't back down. And what I've found again and again through these historical stories that I have been learning, it's all about the intimate and the courageous stories of individuals. And so in this case, Robert Meyer doesn't back down, and he takes his case up to the courts. And he takes his case up to the Supreme Court. In 1923, the Supreme Court comes back in favor of Robert Meyer, enshrining for the first time the rights for students to learn languages other than English. My second story, Mendez v. Westminster. 1943, the Mendez family returned to Westminster, California. They're leasing a prodigious asparagus farm, and they go to enroll their kids in their dad's alma mater. But when they go to enroll their kids, the clerk says, no, you can't go here. You have to go a mile away to the quote unquote Mexican school. Because at the time in California, there were segregated white and Mexican schools. Indeed, that was the case in much of the Southwest. Now, again, these are the stories of courageous individuals. The Mendezes don't back down. They start to organize. They start to organize with other families on their farm, and then they take that money from that prodigious asparagus farm that they are leasing, and they go hire a civil rights lawyer. And they go sue the school districts. And their case goes up to the Ninth Circuit. And by the time it reaches the Ninth Circuit, it is supported by amicus briefs from across the country, including one written by the NAACP, written specifically by Thurgood Marshall, who has been watching this case as a test case. Now, 1947, the Ninth Circuit comes back in favor of the Mendez family. 2 months later, the governor of California desegregates schools across the state. 6 years later, the governor of California steps down and assumes a new position. What is it? Yeah, it's Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. One of the very first cases he hears, of course, it's Brown v. Board of Education, argued by Thurgood Marshall. And in Thurgood Marshall's notes are the notes from the Mendez case that the lawyer has shared. Now, there are other stories woven into this that are just so powerful. I'm going to give you tidbits of them. That asparagus farm. Why had the Mendezes returned to Westminster? They were leasing the asparagus farm from the Munametsu family, who had recently been incarcerated during the Japanese internment camps of World War II. And for a time, so during the war, the Mendezes would drive the rent money to Potsdam, to the incarceration camps, to give that money to the Munametsu family. And after the war, for a time, the Munametsus and the Mendezes lived together on the farm. And I'll give you just one more story. The lawyer that they hired, the money from that asparagus farm, David Marcus. His parents were refugees from Eastern Europe of Jewish ancestry. And he personally knew what it was like to feel that lack of belonging, to schools tell him that he did not belong. This case was personal to him for a range of reasons. First, he was married to a Mexican immigrant, and he was raising his 3 daughters to be bilingual. And second, for his own personal story, when he was little, and this is a story his daughter shared with me, when he was little, loved to play music, played at a concert violin. But because he was Jewish, he was told to play behind a curtain. Another student was told to stand in front of the curtain and mime the music. So many stories of individuals and the work that goes into them, what become these cases that shape our schools. And then finally, Tyler v. Doe. Late 1970s, Tyler School District in Tyler, Texas changes its policy and says that if you cannot prove legal residence, that each child in your family must pay $1,000 per student to go to the public school system, about 1/4 of an annual undocumented Texan's income. 4 families courageously risk immediate arrest and deportation to sue the Tyler School District. But by walking into that courtroom, they're ready to be arrested. Indeed, they're ready in the way that they pack their cars, knowing that by walking in, they could be arrested by just walking in. Now, their case goes up to the Supreme Court in 1982. By that point, of course, Thurgood Marshall is on the court. 1982, the Supreme Court comes back in favor of the 4 families, enshrining the right for all students access to the public K-12 education system, no matter their documentation status. This, of course, leads to the Dreamer movement. And then when the DREAM Act fails, President Obama announces DACA on the 30th anniversary of Tyler v. Doe. Now, these are just 3 stories of remarkable, courageous individuals. And there are so many more. And there's stories that have impacted and transformed our schools, but there are also stories that are rarely taught and not often known, but I think they need to be known. Now, in addition to all those bigger stories, I think it's also important for us to think about our own personal stories. So here's where I'm gonna make us talk to each other. I'm borrowing a really fantastic conversation series by Professor Carola Suarez Orozco at Harvard and Reimagining Migration, which is really a fantastic migration organization. I'm gonna ask you to talk to each other. We all carry stories of movement and migration in our family. Those could be stories of migration and movement from one side of a city to another. Stories of migration and movement from one state to another. Stories of migration and movement from one country to another. Some of those stories that we carry, and we carry many stories, some of those stories are stories of migration by force, and some of those are stories of migration by choice. And some of those are somewhere in between. What I'd like you to do is to think of one of your stories of movement and migration, just one that you're willing to share with a partner today. So again, you're choosing which story you want to share out of the many. I could tell you about how my family, when I was 13, moved from one side of the Cambridge to the other side of Cambridge. Instead, I could tell you about how my parents were born in New York, and then my mom moved to Florida, my dad moved to England, and then they both ended up in Massachusetts. Or I could tell you the story of my great-grandfather, Daniel, who he and his family fled what is now Ukraine as Jewish refugees and arrived in New York when he was 7 in 1906. I'll tell you any stories. What I'd like you to do, we're going to do this short, but what I'm going to ask you to do is to turn to the person next to you. If you don't know each other, introduce yourself. And you're going to have about 2.5, 3 minutes. And I know that's short. When I do this with my students, we do this for 15 to 20 minutes each. And we have a whole series of questions. But we're going to do it for 2 to 3 minutes each. And I'm going to have one of you choose to be the person asking, and one of you be the person sharing. So if Sam and I are doing this, maybe Sam's gonna share first and I'm gonna ask him questions for 3 minutes and he's gonna share with me his story. And then after those 3 minutes, he's gonna now ask me questions. I'm gonna share some of my story. Again, you're choosing which story of migration you're sharing tonight. And if I ask Sam a question, he doesn't want to answer it, he can totally say, no, that's okay, but ask me another one. Now, I might ask questions of Sam and he might not know the answer. That's part of our stories too. Some of the questions that we have about our family, we don't know the answer to and cannot find the answer to, either because it's been lost or it's been stolen from us. And those are important parts of our stories as well. Any questions on what we're going to do? Okay. So I'd love for you to pair up, introduce yourself. I'm going to give us about 2.5 minutes. Choose one person to go first, one person to go second. And then I will tell you to switch halfway through. Call out my brother. Find someone I go talk. Yes, start the asking, yeah. I will. Can I bring you in to, I know you don't have a partner, so maybe there need three of you. I just don't wanna have someone left out.
I don't remember which one it was. I don't know. Graduated. Be honest with you, I think that's scary. I want to hear more about every one of my aunts, but my dad did. Yeah, I have a suspicion that I was in the year. My dad. I know my grandfather's.
I was happy just sitting there because
I think that's that's why when I was on CNN and able to do is more about work ethic. And then I'm sorry, you know, I'm not going to stop and grow my
I'd like you to switch.
Oh, wow.
This is a
I mean, similarly,
How it does.
summer. Oh, and so I moved during the summer, so it was waiting for that fall. So, hoping this is here instead. We definitely stepped in, and I think that part of those realizations just realizing like, if we needed to size. As a sort, you doing things that really matter.
Well, yeah, so let's hope so, Anthony. I don't know.
Let's back together. Okay, that last song. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing. Just ask you to do something. We often don't share these stories of migration with our friends or talk about them often with our families, depending on which story you're sharing. And I've just asked you to share that possibly with a complete stranger who's no longer a stranger. But I want to just take a moment to do a little bit of reflecting, and we won't pause for that long here, but I'd like you to consider these questions. What was it like telling your story? What emotions did you feel? Depending on the story you shared, that brings up a range of different emotions, possibly. What connections did you see between your two stories? What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about your partner? And what did you learn about your community here at Tufts? And then if there was something that you could ask a family member and that family member doesn't need to be with us anymore, what would you want to ask? What are you curious about? I'm wondering if maybe one or two voices in the room want to just share out very briefly on any of these questions, whatever's speaking to you, just one or two. I'm curious. I'll give you a moment to think. Let's reflect. It's also okay if you don't, but yeah.
In both of our stories, one of our great grandparents won the lottery.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. I love those connections that you found between your kids. Do you know each other before? Okay. So you're learning new things about each other. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Who's willing to share, to reflect on any of those questions?
I think okay. So I was reflecting a little bit on my Armenian grandfather who escaped the genocide and came here orphaned to work at the mills in Lawrence, and dropped out of school when he was in 8th grade. And I am a teacher, and I was wondering if he would have dropped out had he been given the chance to be him. If he was allowed to speak Armenian, bring his Armenian food, and just be him. If he had a sense of belonging, if he would have stayed in school. That's what I would have asked him.
It's a beautiful question. I am thinking about connections, even just with what you shared. I think about my great-grandfather Daniel, and when he arrived in the US in New York City in 1906, his language, his religion, his culture, his history were not wanted or welcome. And we lost a lot of that as a family. And we brought some of that back, but also some of particularly that history of lost because they did not carry on those traditions. And so what would our family traditions be if he had similarly felt all that his whole self was wanted and valued in school? Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else want to share? That's okay if you don't. I just want to pause for me. Yeah.
I could share that I lost some family members. I didn't lose them, I guess, in history. Who and their deaths weren't properly investigated because they were part of a minority. I would ask them, how do you die?
I appreciate it. I find when I do this with my kids, and as I said, we do these conversations for about 30 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes each. And there's a whole series of questions. I'm happy to share those. The connections we find between our stories are really, really powerful. Even if the stories of migration we're sharing are 100 years apart in where they took place. I want to move from the past and go to the present. I want to share with you very briefly 4 stories of the present. I had the opportunity to travel across the country, and I am really inspired by the creativity of what's going on, the innovation going on across the country. I'm just going to give you 4 quick stories. The first takes us to Aurora, Colorado. And in Aurora, Colorado, there is something called the Aurora Action Zone. Many schools are open at 7, close at 3, and they're big hulking buildings that stay shut most of the day. What the Aurora Action Zone does is re-envisions what schools can be as vibrant hubs of the community open from sunrise to sunset. And so these 5 schools came together and they have reached out into the community to build lasting and ongoing partnerships with the local hospital, nonprofits, businesses, and also immigrant families. And they are in continuous collaboration, all in support of immigrant kiddos, but also in support of each other. And I think what's really powerful about the work that they're doing here is the ways in which every single organization involved is benefited by being connected and the school being that connecting point. So that's what's happening in Aurora that I'm excited about. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's happening in Guilford County, North Carolina, because I really, really like the work they're doing there. So Guilford County, North Carolina, which at the heart of Guilford County is the historic city of Greensboro, has as its EL director, Myra Hayes. And she and her team support 126 schools, teachers and students at those 126 schools. And for years, she had been working on a whole range of strategies and approaches to try to support her immigrant students, her English learners. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Some worked for a time, then didn't really have the results she was looking for. But they kept looking for things, they kept innovating. And then she came across a whole approach to reimagining literacy and how literacy was taught to newcomers. So when I went to a high school in Guilford County, I saw in a classroom of newcomers new to the country less than a year, students grappling with the following sentence. On an autumn night in 1607, a furtive group of men, women, and children set off in a relay of small boats from the English village of Scrooby in pursuit of the immigrants' oldest dream, a fresh start in another country. Now, when I was in this classroom watching these kids, they were pulling the sentence apart, putting it back together, trying to understand words like furtive, relay. I was fascinated. And then one of Myra's teams leaned over to me. He whispered in my ear and said, you know, if you'd come to this school, to this classroom 3 years earlier, you would have seen students looking at something like the following sentence. Chimpanzees are eating bananas. Bananas are yellow. What wildly different sets of expectations for our kids encapsulated in those 2 sentences. And what I find particularly striking is how Myra is able to get from here to there for an entire district. All of us, I think, have probably experienced either at school or at organizations we've worked with or been a part of, great ideas that don't stick. Flashes in the pan. How did you get this to be so sticky? Whole range of ways, from monthly and group PDs to one-on-one sessions with skeptical teachers and leaders to you're struggling, let me come model a lesson, actually just be in the classroom and teach for you for a day. Do you want to co-teach for a day? You're struggling to find compelling, juicy academic language. I'll go to the library. I'll find that language and I'll drive it to your classroom. No task was too small. How do we find best practice? Let's go around and photograph it and share that so that you can all be connected, even if you can't be in each other's room at the same time. And it was all of these ways in which she was able and her team was able to take a whole district of teachers from here to there. And then 3 years later, you start seeing test scores shooting up all across the board. And you start seeing leaders of schools and mainstream teachers start going to the EL teachers going, what are you doing? Because this little boy who has been silent in my class is suddenly speaking. And so they're taking this approach and expanding across the entire district for all classrooms. The next story is that of the Global Village Project in Decatur, Georgia. The Global Village Project is the only school in the United States dedicated to refugee girls who've spent a long time out of school. Today in the US, if you are a 16-year-old young girl and you have perhaps never had the chance at academic formal schooling, you arrive in the US, you are going to be put in 10th or 11th grade. Good luck. And that's not a winning strategy, and the Global Village Project knows that. These young women might need to start at a kindergarten level of education, but at the same time, the school recognizes that these are young women who have likely shouldered the responsibility of adults for many years, and you cannot treat them like kindergartners. You have to honor both of those identities. And so what the Global Village Project has done is created a whole curriculum that is very nimble and specific to each student, meeting where they are, with content that respects that maturity and those funds of knowledge. And it also taps the community and brings in volunteers from the entire community that meet one-on-one with students to help them practice, to create mentorship programs. These mentors are usually older men and women, lowers the bar for embarrassment of practicing a new language. I'll be the first to say, my brother knows this, who's here tonight. I'm not good with languages in the traditional academic school setting, in the way that schools often teach them. And my high school Spanish class left me in tears. It's really hard to learn a language for some students, and it's really hard to make mistakes in front of your peers. You don't want to look like a fool. But you need to make mistakes if you're going to learn a new language, if you're going to learn anything new. And so learning and practicing with folks who could be your grandparents lowers that bar for embarrassment. It gives you one-on-one and continuous practice with the native speaker of that language, which you again need to really master a new language. And it also creates those relationships that then build into mentorships that then help students and their families navigate high school and then college. And then finally, at the classroom level, Leah Julke in North Dakota. Now, Leah teaches recent immigrant and refugee students, and she was also seeing all the ways in which her students felt othered in her school, and the ways in which there were barriers between sort of an us versus them, old Dakotans and new Dakotans. And so she created a class called the Partnership Class, which had old Dakotans and new Dakotans. And in so many different ways, started to build partnerships and bridges, ways where students were sharing stories, sort of like what you guys did here, and then stepping into each other's shoes so that they took on and actually spoke in the I voice about their partner's story. Where students crafted lessons together, sharing traditions and practices and academic content, and taught each other, and then went out into the community and taught together. Sharing stories of self and publishing those stories, and then speaking in front of the community. And all these different ways, tapping into the strengths and assets of her students, tapping into her students as teachers, and using those stories as opportunities and ways to build bridges. Four stories of present. Now, I want to very, very quickly talk about the personal, because I do want to leave time for questions. And I also want to mention the possible briefly. It's really important for us to be learning from our young people. And I had the opportunity when I was writing this book to sit down with 7 of my former students, remarkable young people who courageously and generously shared parts of their stories. And they have so much to teach us from Chori, a young man who grew up in Baghdad, survived multiple suicide bombs. And when he came to the US, found few places where he felt safe in school or outside. To Srey Nith, who is the daughter of Cambodian genocide survivor, who I still remember the day she came into my class. She was a sophomore, really excited about this like concept of coding. And she couldn't get into the coding class because it was halfway through the semester. And so she just taught herself. And by the time she had taught herself, she'd actually blown through all of the classes at our school. And so continued to teach herself in hopes to become either a computer scientist or an entrepreneur, or some of both. And then of course, Robert, whose family was murdered when he was little in ethnic conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who then escaped to Uganda and lived for many years on his own. He's one of those students like those at the Global Village Project. He started his formal education at age 12 at the border of Uganda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In a refugee camp in Uganda, he started learning languages. We think about like ESL, English as a second language, which we don't use anymore as a term, but is often still used in some places. For Robert, it's ETL, English as a 10th language. And Robert then miraculously finds some of his extended family in a refugee camp, comes to the US. I met him in his first full year at school in high school. He is now a graduate student studying conflict resolution and coexistence at Brandeis University. Just remarkable, remarkable young people. And we have so much to learn from them. So we have these stories of the past, the present, and the personal. And now here's the work that I need from you. How do we imagine what's possible? How do we take them and think about how we reshape immigrant education so that all of our young people feel that sense of belonging both in our schools and our community, so that they can feel that here can be home, that they are valued for all their identities and all their strengths, and that they are best set up to succeed both in school and out. So I return to those 8 pillars. And to think about the ways in which we can be crafting policies, programs, and practices to support our young people. Now, in my book, which I know some of you have, I include at the end a section of ideas, and these are ideas pulled from the book. And this is, as I label here, and I put up there too, version 1.0, because I know it needs to be iterated on, and I hope some of you might help iterate on it. But I give you just a few of the many ideas that folks I talked to shared with me. And they're ideas that draw on everyone's skills, draw on everyone in the community's involvement. So we have work that teachers can lead on. We have work that schools can lead on, that colleges and universities can lead on, that community organizations can lead on, and that departments of ed can lead on, and other policy departments. And again, these are just 4 of many, many examples. But I think the takeaway for me is that there is a role for everyone in this room and everyone in the community to be involved in this work. And I hope that you will be involved in this work. No matter what you're choosing to do for students in the room, what career paths you're choosing to take, there's a role you can play in doing this work. And I hope you'll get engaged. So I'll leave you with some ideas of there is great practice out there. It's often not known. Go seek it out. And then how can we help make sure that more people know about it so we can learn from them and we can grapple with the challenges together? How can we build then those collaborations? I'd love to see more collaborations between universities and schools, and university schools and policymakers and organizations that are in an ongoing way. How do we do that? And I'd love your help here. That's some of the work I'm doing now. How do we center young people's voices? How do we ensure that we are listening to, learning from, and inviting young people to be in those conversations and help lead in those conversations? And then just the end, please get engaged. Please be part of this work. Again, there's room for all of us in this work, and we really need everyone in this work. So I wanted to make sure there were time for questions. We've got about 15-ish minutes. But I want to thank you so much for inviting me to come talk. It really is an honor. It means a lot. And this is the work that I'm deeply passionate about, and I think it needs all of us. So I hope you'll get engaged. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've worked in 2 refugee camps in Greece, and one thing that I was really struck by was the role of non-formal education and helping bring about a sense of belonging among different children. And I'm wondering if you have also found that extracurricular programs in the US and these sports programs have helped with that. And if so, could you elaborate a little bit more on like what that looks like in this context here?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think to that point, exactly that it's not just the work of schools and like the traditional schools that we might think of that should be doing this work and are part of this work. So I think there's so many roles for nonprofits to play and organizations and clubs and sports. And I think it's about how we invite our kiddos into those spaces, both make them aware, but also make them accessible. So for example, Julian, who is one of the students I write about, this was sports through the school, but could be a sport outside. Had never heard of crew before he came. He comes from Colombia, but wanted to at first just get more in shape. And so decided to sign up for crew. And originally the crew team was like not very welcoming, but it's through his own perseverance that he stuck with it and then actually ended up becoming a leader in crew. Now, a lot of my kids don't get onto the sports teams for a whole range of reasons and a whole range of barriers. And so I think we should be thinking about, do our kiddos feel welcome in those spaces? Not even just are they accessible, but I think they have really important roles, particularly those in the community that might not be connected to the schools. And so how do organizations outside the schools connect with the schools so that kids can learn about them? We think about the Aurora Action Zone. Schools can be a great hub for helping kids or families know about organizations. That's like a really obvious place to connect and help teach kids about organizations. And I don't think that always happens, but absolutely. Great point. And thank you for the work you were doing in Greece.
Yeah, just thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I actually have 2 questions, if I may. The first one is, so you've been mentioning quite in depth the American case.
Yes.
And I know that the United States of America are a whole continent themselves. But I'm curious, talking about best practices, what
Globally?
you've met globally.
Yeah.
Are there some countries that have been developing specifically remarkable initiatives? And my second question is about the notion of belonging that encompasses various sub-notions. But I'm curious to know if when you built your book, you also thought about potential different notions and that you decided to put aside to select the notion of belonging.
Love that. So to your first question around thinking about or best practice outside of the US. I will be honest that I didn't focus on that for the book, but I know they're out there just from the other work that I've done. And there are a number of great organizations that are looking specifically at best practice in the immigrant refugee space. So REACH is an organization out of Harvard, run by Sarah Dryden Peterson, who's a really fantastic professor of refugee education. And she has some really, really powerful examples of organizations that are sort of doing similar work. I hope and think that the framework could still be applied elsewhere, but I don't know the specific organizations that are doing that. I've heard from my kids of sort of anecdotal examples, but haven't like investigated them in the depth that I did for the US, but great question. To the pillars of belonging and sort of how coming about them and were there parts that were set aside? It's a really interesting question, and the pillars came about near the end of the book, not at the beginning. So the framework of the past, present, personal came at the very beginning. I needed these three sets of stories. But then thinking about the concept of belonging and that really all these stories were about belonging came about a year and a half into writing, and sort of near the 2/3, 3/4 the way through the book process. And it was then pulling out all of the lessons and like putting them on Post-it notes on the tables of the living room. I think, I'm now trying to sort of think back and process, were there ones that I sort of set aside? So the one that sort of weaves throughout, I'll give you this one, but I think it's sort of woven in strengths. And the one that weaves throughout, but I don't identify as just one pillar on its own, is the importance of high expectations. And I chose not to put it as a separate pillar, I think because it was just woven through everything that I was seeing and writing. But I'm trying to think if there were others, and I don't think there were. But of course, other people might have different conceptions around what belonging means. Just as other people, different students or adults might have different concepts of what it means to be an American. So I'll give you two examples. Two of the students I write about, Sophia, who is a refugee from Iraq. Her brother worked for the US and her family was targeted because of that, and so they had to flee to Turkey. Their family was dispersed across the globe, but some of her family ended up here. And so for her, what it means to be American is this concept of tied in with what home means, and where home is and homes with her family. And so she is partially American, she's still partially Iraqi, but she's also partially like trying to figure that out because her family is spread out across the world. Actually a powerful story on that, if you read Sophia's story. So her family was displaced across the world. Actually, one of her brothers took the boat to Greece. One of her sisters waited in Turkey for a long time and then gave up and went back to Iraq. And one of her sister waited in Turkey. And actually in the book, you hear this, that she waited in Turkey and was still waiting. Her sister's family waited for 10 years. They arrived in the US last night at 10 p.m. I just got the video from Sophia and it's beautiful. So Sophia's family, Sophia's idea of what it means to be American is that. But then if you go to Diane is a student who was born stateless. She was born at the borders of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Zambia. And so for her, she has grown up with no country ever recognizing her and claiming her as theirs. Indeed, I start off the chapter of hers. We were applying to the Common App for college, and the Common App asked you to list what country are you a citizen of? And she cannot answer that question because she is a citizen of nowhere. And so we had to lie on the Common App and put in a country because there was no option for stateless. The Common App does not recognize her existence. For her, what it means to be American means for her to belong is to become a citizen. And it's that moment of getting citizenship for her that changes her sense of belonging. Very different than Sophia's though. So it means something different for each kiddo. Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Jessica, what do you do at Lowell High School with the 16-year-old who comes in not speaking English?
Yeah, so many things. So what do I do or what do I want to do?
Both.
Okay.
Because I think what's happening now is what needs to be looked at.
Yeah, so what's happening now? So I teach 7 periods, 7 classes. I have 6 classes. I have 5 classes and an advisory, about 150 kids, about 30 kids per class. I have students from about 30 different countries, and in a class of 30, I have students who are new to the country less than 3 weeks, and those who've been in the country 5 years. I have students who have a really strong mastery of English as well as their home languages, and some who have almost no English, and all in one class, and it is me. And we have about 45 minutes a day. So we make do is really what's happening right now. I rely on a series of strategies about best supporting students using a range of different learning styles. So we are using translation when needed because I want my kids to learn at the content level that we are holding high expectations and grappling with hard content. And if you need to access that content in another language, that's great. I'm okay with that. Some teachers are not though. And so, but in my class, I want you to access the content. We use different modes of learning. So we're doing listening.
So they're using, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
so they're using like Google
We
Translate.
might be using Google Translate, yep, all sorts of things. And we also use each other. I think one of the things that I find really powerful about my kiddos is the ways in which they're supporting each other all of the And you see that in like all of the small spaces that, again, we're thinking about strengths that are not recognized. A new kid comes in, like a group of 5 kids will come around. I'll show you to the next class. Let me help you to lunch. The amount of ways in which our kids are mentoring and supporting each other that do not usually get acknowledged in our schools is like huge. And they do that in classes too. And some teachers will call that as, oh, like you're cheating if you're helping. No. They are supporting each other in all sorts of ways. And like that builds collaboration. I think about my own learning. The first time I was asked to intentionally collaborate was in grad school. And before then, in every other academic setting, collaboration was cheating. But in the workplace, we almost only collaborate. And so I see such great skill building in the work my kids are doing in collaborating and supporting each other that they're going to carry out into the workforce. What I would like to see is a whole range of support, some of those drawn from those different programs I mentioned. So thinking about our students who are, the technical term is SLIFE, students with limited or interrupted education, students like Robert, and having programs that are specifically for them. We could start with tracking and identifying students. We don't in Massachusetts, we in California do. In Massachusetts, we don't track SLIFE students, so I bet they're hidden in the noise, and we don't know how much they might be struggling as a cohort. And so then we don't focus on them because we're not measuring their successes. So I'd like programs that specifically work with SLIFE students. There are a few such programs in the state. There's 1 or 2, but not many. I would like more flexibility in our curriculum and what our class and school days look like, particularly for our newcomer kiddos. I'd like more access to technology. I think there are, of course, many things that ChatGPT and AI is like in the education space, but in this space, I think it could be really exciting for helping kids with accessing academically rigorous content in home language, while also supporting English language acquisition. I don't think we're quite there yet, but like I see really exciting possibilities for that. So those are some of the ways I'm imagining what it could be, and those are some of the ways too that we do the work now.
Yeah, thanks. I am thinking about the fact that a lot of your students are arriving in the US at a time when Americans don't all agree on what it means to be American.
Have we ever?
Well, maybe a particularly heightened time, or maybe we just think that because we're living in it. I don't know. But I'm also a former high school teacher and noticed that students were often somewhat jaded about kind of civic engagement and the systems that we do have in the United States. So I'm curious, I don't know exactly what my question is, but I'm thinking about your students coming from different immigrant backgrounds, interacting with students who have grown up in the United States at a big public high school. And how are your students kind of reckoning with and reconciling, the backgrounds that they come from, which have their own sets of hardships, with what they're seeing here, what they're experiencing here, what they're hearing from their American peers about life in the United States right now. All of that. I don't know if that's quite a question,
No, I can pull
but
2 things from that. So
Okay.
one, civically engaged, my kids are really deeply passionate about their new communities and creating new homes and new lives here and getting involved. So actually we work with the organization Generation Citizen, and each spring we spend months working on an Action Civics project that my kids care deeply about, and they work collaboratively and then go talk with policymakers and go talk with local leaders in our community. And they're like deeply passionate about that work. They care. I think what is powerful in that work we do is they care deeply, but they do not know if people will care about them. And so there is always that moment in these classes where like we're typing up a letter to like a city official, and they will turn to me and be like, so this is pretend, right? And get like, no, this is not pretend. We are actually going to send it. And the eyes get really big and they sort of freak out, but then they send it. And then when someone writes back, that's that moment of impact, because adults in the community here are saying, actually, we do value your voice. The second part, to American-born kiddos, I think that's also an important part of the work we need to do. there is a big divide usually between newcomers and kiddos who they or their families have been in the country for multiple generations. There's a lot of us versus them from both sides. So when I talk with some of my kiddos, Carla, one of my students who I profile from the Dominican Republic, talks about the quote unquote American halls or the white halls of the school. She uses those words synonymously, even recognizing though that it's not just white kids, but it's those kids, and that's not for me. Those halls are not mine. I can't walk in those halls. And it's of course not a policy, but that is what she is perceiving. Sophia, my student from Iraq, somehow felt, and this is devastating to hear, but was taught by the school that her first year here, when she was mastering a new language, she'd already mastered, of course, Arabic growing up, Turkish when she was living in Turkey, and now she was in a new country learning another language, navigating a whole bunch of systems for her family, learning a whole new system of school. And that first year here, she felt like she was somehow working less hard than her American-born peers. That's what the school taught her. Again, not in an explicit way, but implicitly. And like, that's horrible, because of course she's working tremendously hard. So there's a lot of othering between our students, and a lot of the work of thinking about ensuring that our students feel that sense of belonging needs to be on the work that we are doing and thinking about how we're building bridges and how we are building points of connection. It's part of why I started with that moving stories exercise, is that we all carry different stories of migration movement, not even if we're just talking about those crossing national borders. What are those points of connection? And then also let's celebrate those differences. But I teach one class that is a mix of newcomers and kiddos who've been in the country longer. And often I hear from my kids when they come in, they have never had or rarely have friends or no kids of the quote unquote other group. And how shocking it is for them when they start to build those connections and friendships. And they tell me this. We don't create enough of those opportunities, and that's a part of the problem. Yeah, I think we have time for like one more question, I promised you, but I will stick around. So, yeah.
Thanks, yeah. I had a question about you as an EL teacher.
Yeah.
With so many students that come from so many places, it's probably so many different languages,
Yes.
cultures. How do you feel the United States education system addresses forced assimilation and then cultural erasure?
Yeah.
I know you talked about it a bit in your book about your own history of the past. How do you address that in your classroom, and how does it already?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think schools are at a range of levels of doing, of acknowledging, supporting, investing, valuing all of the identities of our students. Some are doing really well and some are doing not so well. Historically, there was a very narrow sense of what it meant to be American, and the Americanization movement in the early 1900s had a very, very narrow sense, Anglo-Saxon, and you must conform to that. We've come a long way, and there are huge, huge gains that I've seen. There's also still a lot of work to do. So it's the ways in which schools are valuing the languages our students bring. Valuing that in the academic content of our classes, and also just in the ways we're speaking with our kids. Are you hearing folks say, speak English? Or are you seeing teachers valuing those language and reminding of the importance of knowing multiple languages, that's a real strength and asset. It's the ways we think about our curriculum and what history we're teaching and whose stories we're teaching. I'll just, for these histories of migration and immigration policies, a lot of these stories that I learned from my book are now in my curriculum. They weren't there before because I didn't know them. So it's also, what do we teach our teachers? If our teachers don't have that knowledge, it is hard to have them be able to bring that into their curriculum. So how are we rethinking our curriculums? How are we rethinking the looks of our schools? What's in our hallways? What's in our cafeterias? All of those are signs of what we value. And so I'll give you just a small example, and food is a small thing, but can be important. So in Lowell, we have the second largest Cambodian community outside of Cambodia. First is in Long Beach, California. Until 2 years ago, Cambodian food had never been served in the cafeteria. And the day it was served, it was really, really powerful to just see kids' faces light up and go, we cook that at home, and that's in the cafeteria now. And that's a tiny thing, but it's an example of what we do in the hallways or in the cafeterias or in the curriculum, show our kids what we value and what we don't value. So we can do it in all sorts of ways, from the big to the very small. Thank you for the question. I want to thank you all. I want to respect your time. I know you are all busy, busy peoples. Thank you so much for engaging with me.